Educating HG, Part 3. Hello, I'm HG Tudor. In Part 2, I explained to you that I had been appointed deputy head boy at my school in my 5th year, and furthermore, that my first reading was an edifying experience as I read in assembly, and that put me on a path of doing more of those readings, but also embracing public speaking, both in school and as something that has served me well as an adult. One of my duties as deputy head boy was to organise the appropriate readings in assembly. This was a relative new development and appeared to be a delegation of activity from the religious education teacher, who basically explained that there were certain texts that needed to be read at certain times of the year, and that largely I could choose similar kind of texts, ensuring that the reading was only for a minute or two. I understood the briefing perfectly well. Accordingly, it was left for me to marry up the person who'd been selected to do the reading with the reading and ensure that they were there on the day, on the stage, ready to give their reading from the relevant piece of text that had been selected. It came to pass that an individual that was going to be giving the reading was one of my friends. We'll call him Andrew. He is still my friend to this day, and I have intermittent interaction with him on a number of times throughout the course of the year. He was particularly nervous about undertaking his reading, as it became apparent that this was the first time he was doing so. Nearly everybody will have been selected to undertake a reading, save for the epsilon semi-morons, in their first or second year. Indeed, those of us who were more accomplished at it may well have read 3, 4, 5, 6 times by the time we reached our 5th year. This meant that everybody will have experienced standing on that stage, gripping the lectern, and hastily, often rushing, through whatever had been written out for them or was printed in the Bible. For Andrew, he had somehow missed out doing this. The real reason as to why that wasn't entirely clear. Perhaps he had been unwell on the occasion when he'd been initially earmarked to speak and then had been overlooked thereafter. This left him with a slight dilemma. He was particularly nervous because this was the first time that he'd ever done it, but there was also an expectation that by the time one had reached the 5th year, one would have done a number of readings and therefore wouldn't be appearing with tremulous voice and shaking hands, both of which it was clear that he was afflicted by. As it was approaching Christmas, he had been charged with reading in relation to the 3 kings visiting Jesus Christ, and he had the appropriate section from the Bible provided to him. As the time for him to speak drew near, I decided that it would be better for him to actually have his short text, it was only a couple of paragraphs, written out on a piece of paper for him, so that he could focus on those words rather than suddenly be confronted with the rather small print of the appropriate Bible and having to find where his section was. That would not have helped him. It would have caused hesitation, and the creeping nervousness may well have spilled over into him starting from the wrong place. I therefore deemed that it would be appropriate to help him in this way. I'm good like that, you see. Thus, I wrote out in my own fair legible hand the 2 paragraphs that he was to read, placed it on a piece of paper, and on the morning that we attended on the stage, I could see that he was white with nervousness. "Don't be nervous, Andrew," I stated. "It's really straightforward. Just read the words." "It's okay for you, HG. You're used to this kind of thing. You love it up here. I can't stand it. I think I'm going to be sick. And whatever you do, don't be sick. That will not do," I explained to him. "Look, in order to make it easier for you, I've written it out on a piece of paper." I lifted the piece of paper from my pocket and brandished it for him. "Ah, right," he said. "Yeah, I thought that rather than you have to try and find your starting point amidst all of the text, if you just read precisely what's on this piece of paper, then all will be well. Oh, thanks, HG. I appreciate you doing that. Not a problem, I said. We both stood waiting, and then it was the appropriate time for Andrew to give his reading. I took the Bible from him and handed him the piece of paper. He strode up to the lectern, legs wobbling, and unfolded the paper. He gave a nervous cough, and then he started to read. There was a slight shake to his voice, but he was doing better than one expected. And he made his way through the appropriate text until he got to the part where he needed to describe the 3 gifts that were being delivered to Jesus. As you know, those 3 gifts consisted of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Your glorious narrator had decided that it would be most entertaining to change the text to gold, myrrh, and something else. I knew that given his nervousness, he wouldn't actually be registering what he was reading, but rather would go into automaton mode, and therefore he would just simply read out what was in front of him without thinking about it first. Unlike a practiced speaker who is looking a few words ahead, understanding positioning of the text, appropriate intonation, context, etc., he would just be regurgitating the words on a hand-to-mouth basis, and I knew, therefore, that whatever was written, he would just read it out unquestionably. He read, gold, incest, and myrrh. Immediately, hilarity broke out amongst the school, and I could even see a number of teachers attempting to stifle their own amusement at him misreading, or rather, not misreading, for I had written incest, but it would appear to everybody else that he had chosen the wrong word by saying incest rather than incense. He stopped as a consequence of all of the laughter, and it took a moment before he realized what he'd actually said. I was correct. He was simply reading out what was in front of him without it registering. Immediately, he flushed, and the whiteness was replaced by burning red cheeks. I felt that delicious surge of recognition as a consequence of the prank that I had played upon him. To his credit, he finished the reading. He didn't bolt from the lectern, and as the laughter subsided, he pressed on. He was known for some time after that as Incest Man. I found it all too entertaining. Interestingly, he never accused me of causing him a problem for him. He raised it with me, and I explained, it was my mistake. I must have been thinking about something else when I was writing it out, which led to a somewhat quizzical view being provided by him. But nevertheless, he didn't accuse me of doing it on purpose. Such was the nature of our friendship. In a peculiar kind of way, after the initial embarrassment had died down as to saying incest rather than incense, he rather liked the recognition that came with the fact that people knew him as the chap who had read out the wrong word. This went on for some time thereafter, and people would often yell incest at him in the schoolyard, which of course those who were unfamiliar in later years as to why he had said this would perhaps think that the word was being used in an alternative context for him. But it all stemmed from the notoriety of him reading out the correct word, but having been given the wrong word by your glorious narrator. The fact of undertaking so many readings, and each time doing so having memorized it, rather than actually standing and just reading from the book or from a card, drew the attention of my English teacher. She, a bespectacled, slightly curly-haired lady who absolutely hated the rain, called me into her class one day, or rather her classroom. "You read and speak very well, H.G., she explained. I thanked her. Always important to be polite. "I'd like you to be the principal speaker in our next public speaking competition." This was pleasing. She was asking me 1 year earlier than one would ordinarily do this. I think you have the confidence in the delivery to carry it off." "So do I, miss," I replied. It was not a wild boast. I had complete confidence in my ability to do it. "You rather thrive on that stage, don't you? I've noticed that when you give your readings, you always do it from memory. Why is that?" "It gives me a challenge, miss. It's too easy just to read the text. Better to remember it. And also, I like to look at everybody sat there as I speak. I like to see what they're doing. I like to see if they're listening. I like to see how they respond to what I'm saying." She nodded, although she of course didn't truly understand the underlying reason why I revelled in giving these readings and why I wanted to ensure that I saw the reactions of those around me. "That confidence is to be admired. It'll serve you well. What you need to do is select a subject, something interesting, something topical, and then I'll introduce you to the other members of the public speaking team." I knew that the other members of the speaking team would come from the year above me, apart from one who would be a younger child. There would be me as the speaker, there would be somebody who would play the role of chair, there would be somebody who would propose a vote of thanks, and there would be somebody who would respond to that vote of thanks. It was traditionally the case that the person proposing the vote of thanks, the speaker and the chair, would all come from the final year, and that the individual responding to the vote of thanks was often a second or third year. Here, I, as the speaker, had been selected from the fourth year rather than the fifth year. That was as a consequence of noting my prowess in delivery in these readings that were given in assembly. It was now for me to determine what I would speak about. I actually chose a subject which was in relation to journalism, as originally that was the career that I had wanted to embark upon. My speech was about the role of the press and its role with regard to freedom of the press. My teacher gave me some tips and observations, some little tweaks, which I received in the spirit in which they were intended for the purposes of what I was to talk about. And we then embarked upon various rehearsals, undertaking them during lunchtimes until we became the polished item. I recall that the first round was to take place at another school in the evening. Matriarch and my father both wished to attend. As it happened, however, Matriarch had another commitment, and therefore I was rather pleased that she would not be in attendance. My father attended, and was very proud of what I was doing. We won, and I recall particularly facing some quite interesting questioning from the headmaster of the local sixth form college, one to which I would ultimately go on to, and oddly enough, that he would remember my speech when I attended that sixth form college. Having succeeded, we then went on to the regional finals. We won there. It was then on to the national finals, where we came second. That was disappointing. We ought to have won, but the person proposing the vote of thanks fluffed their lines at one point, which was hugely disappointing given the number of times that we'd been through this over and over again. Nevertheless, to come second nationally brought considerable fuel for me, both in terms of attendance at that national final, with many hundreds of people in attendance, but also with regard to the recognition when we returned to school to be paraded like the champions we ought to have been in front of the school for our achievement, showing off our medals, and the headmaster beaming with delight as we were viewed as ambassadors for the school, one of his favourite phrases. But this was just the start. This was just the first competition, and we went on with others. But what it did was set in place a desire for me to be able to talk to people, to be able to stand upon a stage or behind a lectern, to issue forth my thoughts, to be able to preach to people about certain topics, to draw them in. The experience of giving those readings and becoming a public speaker through school served me particularly well in understanding the way that audiences respond, the way that human beings respond to what they're being told, phrases which stand out, the form of delivery which matters to them, and also their attention spans, recognizing that too great a length results in people mind wandering, for their slack intellectual mind is unable to cope with the prolonged necessity of concentration much of the time. But being elevated in that way, be it standing behind a lectern, on a podium, on a stage, having an audience, listening to each word that was being delivered, that provided me with power and control, and it's something that I revelled in, and it had all begun as part of my education. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.